3 years ago, Key's candidates were expressing concern and committing to resolving what was popularly believed to be a housing crisis. Government's flagship solution to the lack of funds to deliver high-quality, comprehensive public services is to grow the economically active part of the population, so generating more tax income. To do that, we need more houses for this wave of new residents to live in. But 3 years into this House of Key's term of office, has much actually changed? I'm joined in the studio by David Ashford, MHK, Chair of the Housing and Communities Board, and Ramsey Town Commissioner Ewan McGuinness. Perhaps if we start with, the pair of you, an open question. We're 3 years into this administration. Are you convinced that the right measures are being taken to actually address what was described by pretty much all the candidates as a housing crisis?
Well, from my point of view, the right measures are being taken, but it's not going fast enough. This is something I've said many times before. We need to move faster. We need to actually be starting to build things. I'm sure we'll come on to the topic about social housing, but one of the things that the objective assessment of housing need that the government has commissioned and has recently been published shows, if government is going to meet any of its baseline predictions around the economy, around the development of the island, then it's actually going to need to start ensuring there's an environment to build things, and affordable housing at that. And at the moment, my view is the pace isn't quick enough. This is what I've been saying at the Housing and Communities Board. We need to actually pick up the pace now. The first few years were around collating the data and making sure we've got the policies to be able to move forward with. Now is actually delivering and building things that people can see and feel.
Ewan?
I mean, I don't disagree that things should be going a lot faster. What I would say is, did we really need 3 years to create some policies and gather some data to what was patently obvious to everybody 3 years, 5 years, maybe even in 10 years ago? There's all these reports and papers have just reinforced what anyone could have told you, and realistically there's nothing that's been put in those papers that couldn't have been done in parallel with getting some properties built.
And this is often a charge that we hear about government, that the blindingly obvious still needs to be evidenced, and it still needs committees and various reports and people to consider and discussions to be had for the blindingly obvious to then be identified as clearly it is blindingly obvious because we've got all these reports that says it is. Is this this is not necessarily just a housing issue? Is this a cross-government problem that we're probably living in a time when we had generous amounts of money that we could spend on all this, and maybe we've moved on, and now all the officers are spending their time gathering the evidence as they perhaps used to, but there aren't enough left to actually deliver?
Well, the big problem has been not having the actual data to prove things. You say there, Phil, about it being blindingly obvious, but with all due respect, there's been many occasions where government and even probably the public out there have actually believed something is blindingly obvious, and then it's turned out not to be the case once the data is being collated. What we've got to do is ensure that what we're dealing with is hard facts rather than perception, and that's precisely what we've been developing. So we can use another aspect of housing, which is the homelessness, to actually prove that. We know, for instance, we've known for years, something that, again, you've used the phrase blindingly obvious, people have been sofa surfing. But what we haven't necessarily known is what is the underlying issues of those individuals, and that's what the data has been able to collate and actually allow us to try and address. Because what we don't want to be doing in relation to homelessness is setting people up with temporary accommodation continuously and keeping people in that cycle. We need to find something more permanent for them, but one size doesn't fit all, because everyone has individual needs, and that is what the data collection has been able to do. So data collection can be take frustrating amount of time, mainly because Isle of Man government, let's be frank, over the last 20 years has not been great at keeping data sets, or deciding halfway through something they're going to change the way data is recorded, so things aren't comparable. So we're starting with a lot of things from scratch, and housing's no different to that.
Ewan, would you perhaps, in light of David's comments there, do you think perhaps you were a little harsh in your initial remarks?
No, I thought I was being quite generous. The housing data has been widely available. We've all got housing lists from the local authorities and the DOI, so we know there's a housing need. The worst case scenario is you're end up with some additional houses that will be filled. So I see no reason to slow the process, or why we've slowed the process over the past 3 years. I'm not saying that there's no value in data gathering generally, but I think to suggest that we didn't know that there was an affordable housing need right now is simply incorrect. I would go further, and maybe this is slightly unfair, but I think what we have at the moment is a government civil service that's run by fear of negative reaction from the public, and data gathering reports are a great way of finding something else to blame and finding something else to rely upon that isn't our own judgment, whereas actually sometimes it requires some really strong positive thinking. We knew 2 years ago, whenever the Island Plan came out, that housing was needed. So if we feel strongly enough to put it that high up in the Island Plan, why did we need 2 years of reports?
One of the challenges that David has now, and others who've been in his role as a kind of a policy lead when it comes to housing, and of course the housing minister, DOI minister Tim Krukell, and various others who have different bits of responsibility for housing, is housing markets can change fairly swiftly. So, for example, when I was booted out by the electorate back in 2016, I was housing minister. We didn't at that time have any evidence of a housing crisis, and indeed there didn't appear to be much by way of feedback from the public expressing concern at that time. But these things have a habit of changing relatively swiftly, and of course housing is something you can't just switch on and switch off within a few months. It does take a year or two to actually get planning in place and get sufficient backing for developers to make the decision to develop houses.
Well, I think one of the important things, Phil, just following on from that, is again saying how sometimes the perception can be different to the reality, particularly around affordable housing and public housing. What June was saying there, you'd think nothing at all has happened in 3 years. In fact, if you actually look at the figures, a third of all the properties, between 25% and a third of the properties that have been built over the life of this administration on the island have actually been in the public or affordable category. So, for instance, if you take 2023, there was 199 dwellings completed on Ireland. 65 of those were either public sector housing or affordable housing. There was 269 completed in 2022. 56 of those fell into the affordable or public sector housing, and in 2021 there was 195 and 67 of those. So it's not the case of everything's been waiting for the data. Up in my constituency of Douglas North, for instance, we've got the development of the Williston Flats that Douglas Council's been doing. Douglas Council has also managed to provide a replacement for the Lord Street blocks. So there is things actually moving. But if we're going to talk about social housing, I want to bring up something that I've been bringing up for many, many years, even back when I was a Douglas councillor, that is one of the biggest drags on social housing is the way it's funded, which is the deficiency payments. I've always been quite clear the whole system of the way we do the deficiency needs to fundamentally change, because that, in my view, is what actually holds things back. And I've had those conversations with the Treasury Minister and others to actually say we need a better model of funding, because the objective assessment of housing need clearly shows we need to be building 50-odd social housing units a year, up to 1,000 new units in the next 20 years if we are going to actually make the targets just the baseline projection, and that's not going to happen with the current funding formula in place.
Before we neatly segue into June's specialist area of expertise, which is the whole funding of social housing, you mentioned, you read out the figures there in relation to the houses built. One of the points that perhaps the Chief Minister was tripped up on in previously was talking about these houses as new houses, which indeed they are, but with giving the impression that these are extra houses, whereas many of these houses were replacements for houses that had basically reached the end of their useful life. Have you got the figures there on how many are actually new to the island houses as opposed to replacements for old ones?
So most of those are new houses,
right,
because this is the total number of dwellings completed on Ireland. In terms of social housing, and we've done interviews about this before, Phil, one of my concerns is the number hasn't really moved, because if you tick back 20 years, the figure of number of dwellings of social housing has actually remained pretty steady. So, for instance, government's been very good at this in the past, where they've announced new builds down in Castletown, but as you say, it's replacing existing stock. The development up in Williston that I spoke about, that's additional units. That's actually not replacement. The Lord Street one, which I spoke about, obviously is replacement. So what we need to be clear on is that, as I can say, we need those additional 1,000 units of new social housing over the next 20 years. That is within government and the local authorities' control, and we need to be working together to ensure that we can deliver those. And one of the most fundamental things is looking at the funding formula that we're able to do that.
So this does neatly allow Dewan to raise the topic that I know you posted on social media, your concern that perhaps government is no longer interested in building social housing, supporting social housing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you read off the figures of houses that have been built in the past 3 years and say the government have been acting, but realistically they're all developments that were started long before this current regime. That's the nature of housing, and actually the proof of the pudding is that in the past, certainly the past year, if not longer, there has been a real stall. I did that Freedom of Information request to the DOI and Treasury, and evidence that they have gone static in any movement, certainly over, I'd say, the last 6 to 12 months. That's been evidenced in our inability to move forward. You said local authorities' power, but we are beholden to the DOI to approve funding for new houses. I see the more all local authorities and DOI all as one in that regard. If we are not funding houses now, that means that in 3, 5, 10 years' time, those figures that you quote will be looking poorer. You know, Phil, you said that you didn't feel in 2016 that there was necessarily an issue, but we were clearly starting those plans that have resulted in housing now, and that's the nature of it. We have to forward plan. We have to be bringing housing as an asset rather than as a cost. I would be really interested to know what you think is the current issue with the funding deficiency plan at the moment.
So in terms of the deficiency, just to address that, what Ewan's saying, the issue at the moment is it's off the back of a one paragraph Tynwald resolution of 1999. It doesn't actually in law have any basis around it as to how it's run. It's effectively at the behest of government how the deficiency runs, and one of the biggest things is it forms part of DOI's budget. So if the deficiency comes in over the amount expected and budgeted for, DOI has to find that from their day-to-day budget. So that's coming out of their roads budget and everything else, which is fundamentally wrong. What we actually should have is a centralised fund, and I fully agree with you in that we should be seeing housing as an asset, not as a cost. And I think for far too long, public sector housing has actually been seen as being a drain. If you actually take the overall cost of the deficiency of the island and you divide it by the number of social housing units, the actual subsidy on social housing works out about £14 a week, which isn't that much in the scheme of things. So what we need to be doing is ensuring we've got the right funding formula, because at the moment, if DOI is getting close to that deficiency level, then they're going to put the brakes on. They're going to slow things down because they're going to be worried they're going to go over the deficiency budget, and then they've got to start taking that out of the day-to-day pot in other service areas that they're responsible for, including ports, harbours, roads, and I don't think anyone really wants to be seeing that. So it needs to be something completely separate, yes, administered maybe by a government department, but something equally that's easier for local authorities to access too.
And there have been examples in recent months where local authorities have effectively been pushed into a position where they're having to consider stopping schemes because they're not convinced that the funding is going to be made available to them to allow the schemes to continue. That bearing in mind, this is happening in the third year of an administration which was largely elected to solve a housing crisis. That has to be a concern, surely.
Well, it does, and like I say, it's something I've been banging on about for years. It's within government's control to be able to change the rules around the deficiency. I've had these conversations with the Treasury Minister. I know that he is keen to look at the rules as well.
And I know you're a consummate politician, and you won't tell us what the Treasury Minister said in response to these conversations, but it is my job to ask you.
Well, I didn't meet a brick wall, let's put it that
Okay.
way. I think the Treasury Minister does understand that there's issues and there's problems, and I think government does as well. But like I say, I'm not here to represent government because I'm chair of the Housing Communities Board, I'm not a minister. But if government is actually going to push forward with all of its ambitions, so the economic strategy, the population strategy, all of it, I've been quite clear housing has to be front and centre of that. And housing means, as June has quite articulately said, building things. We need to actually now be out there building things, because things don't happen overnight. They do take time to embed in and plan. There's planning to go through, and that again is another situation which needs to be looked at, which is the overall planning system, and have we got the balance right to be able to actually provide what we need as a community.
And June, you don't put in a freedom of information request if you don't think there's a problem. What prompted you to actually do that?
The complete lack of communication between Ramsden Commissioner's offices and the DOI. Now, I even understand the redactions. They're sort of working on government policy. I understand the political answer David's given there about the private discussions and the information you're kind of getting. But I'd say this is just a fundamental issue with the current system we have. It's all secret squirrel meetings. It's all things we can't talk about out in public, which is ridiculous, because what you've got is brownfield sites in Ramsey, for example, that are stalled, that could be getting worked on as new housing developments, and they aren't because no one's able or willing to talk openly about anything. You've got heavily redacted information about the options that are being considered, and I don't disagree with anything David said, that what we've got is a current funding model that the DOI are now scrambling to avoid having to take from other reserves. But we aren't openly talking about this, and while we keep it all behind closed doors, that's, to my mind, how these things just drag on, and that's what we're seeing. We're having these quiet chats and information not being provided and whatever have you, that's resulting in stagnation. And it sounds great what you're suggesting as potential options and discussions to be had. Do I have any faith that any of this will be done before the next general election? Honestly, no. And the reality is that you've got housing waiting lists that are staying where they are or increasing. We've got people needing homes and nothing being done about it. Oh, sorry, lots being done about it, but nothing actually happening and any results occurring.
And that's the measure for the next 2 years, actually, Phil. Again, there's nothing really I disagree with in what Ewan said there. The measure has to be, what are people seeing? Because one of the things I've said, again, for many, many years is there can be lots of activity going on in government, but that actually doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what activity is happening in government office. What matters is what people outside on the street are actually seeing. And I actually agree with June. At the moment, I don't think a lot of people are seeing and feeling that things are changing. And that's what actually does need to fundamentally change over the next 2 years, particularly in relation to housing. People need to see some of these sites that have actually been, left for a long, long time. June obviously focusing on Ramsey. If I focus as an MHK on Douglas, you've got Park Road, you've got the old prison site, you've got all sorts of brownfield sites that have just sat there, that are in government's control for a long, long time. People need to start seeing movement. They need to start seeing there's not just a plan, but something actually happening on the ground. And that is the challenge of the next 2 years in relation to housing, is actually providing the housing that people needs. And that's across the board, ensuring that there's actually a proper regulation of the rental sector and there's provision of rental properties, because at the moment I personally believe there's an issue there as well, that you've got affordable dwellings, that you've got retirement dwellings, that you've got public sector housing, and people need to start seeing that. And at the moment, I fully agree, I don't think people have seen an awful lot in terms of on the ground over the last few years, but that needs to fundamentally change.
Well, we'll carry on this conversation after this short break. You're listening to Perspective with David Ashford, MHK, and Ramsey Town Commissioner Ewan McGuinness. You are into your second term now, David, so you will be a little bit aware about how it is very easy for members to get distracted, particularly away when we're getting 3 years away from the last election. Memories start to fade about just how big certain issues were on the doorstep. Is that what's happening here, that members are getting distracted with other things and perhaps aren't as interested in housing, or are they just completely confident in the Housing and Communities Board and they're leaving it all to you?
Well, I'd love to say it's actual confidence, but no, I think that's unfair on my colleagues to say they're not interested. There's been plenty of questioning around housing. We've had several debates in Tynwald around housing where members have contributed and expressed their concerns. So I think that's a bit unfair on some, particularly a lot of my backbench colleagues who have been very much driving it forward. And I know at a ministerial level as well, there's lots of different ministers engaged in trying to move things forward. I think one of the challenges, to be fair to this administration, which I not necessarily always am, but to be fair, is they have had a lot of challenges come up. There's been the cost of living crisis, which has put added budgetary pressure on things. They've, like I say, not had particularly the data sets to be able to prove, rather than just thinking that it's perception, actually prove the direction of travel. So there's been multiple things being fired from multiple angles from this administration to actually deal with, because housing is important, it is essential, but it's not the only issue out there. And as you know yourself, Phil, when you get hit with 10 or 12 different things at the same time, you've got to be working on all 12, and that does take up time and resource. But the important thing, like I say, for the next 2 years in terms of housing, and my role as chair of the Housing Communities Board, is to put the pressure on and try and drive forward actually delivering things on the ground.
Ewan, then, I mean, you're at a sort of a more local, possibly closer to the ground level when it comes to housing than perhaps David is, because you are a housing authority. Ramsey Town Commission is a housing authority. You're a member of that housing committee. Do you think that... Well, what would you like to see? Were you able to wave a magic wand and get government to actually take seriously some of the points that you're raising? What are the top things that you would like to see change?
I think the government needs to actually walk the walk of its strategic vision, of its principle-led plans. It's identified in the Island Plan that housing is an important priority, but then the reality of it is we get lost in a quagmire of people providing that result or not, as the case may be. We've got funding is the fundamental issue. You mentioned sort of cost of living crisis, and I think that is what has been the trigger of the latest stagnation, because interest rates have risen. And to be fair, they've risen to what is probably a very normal standard compared to a historical low for a number of years. And that seems to have taken everyone by surprise. If you look at the information that wasn't redacted from that FOI, there was consistently over the deficiency years a surplus of money, so everything's been ticking along absolutely fine. It only seems to now be an issue when suddenly, because of the interest rates on the loans, that this is now being seen as an issue. Well, if you truly believe in a strategic island plan, if you truly believe in that end goal, then that wouldn't matter, because you would be focused on the end result, which is housing is needed, housing is an asset, housing is a basic infrastructure. You can see the positive influence of good social housing and good affordable housing in the likes of Austria, and that is long-term visions that really reinvigorate town centres and are massive assets to the working population of the place they live. And that is something that is entirely deliverable by this government if there is the political will and the willingness to stand up for a principle of affordable housing, rather than being bogged down in what we currently have, which is concern over, and I'll come back to what I said earlier, I think there's a fear of having to go to Tynwald, go to Treasury and say we need more money, but there shouldn't be if the island's one of the top priorities, which it claims it is to deliver good housing for the populace of the Isle of Man.
David, on last week's programme we had one of your former Douglas colleagues, Chris Robertshaw, and of course Chris, true to form, was talking about smaller, smarter government. His view is one that you'll be familiar with, that government is trying to focus on too many things, and because it's trying to focus on too many things, it's not actually delivering. And there is no bigger thing than this housing issue, because quite frankly, if you want, as Isle of Man government does, to grow the population, the existing population needs to believe in the project. And if the existing population is saying, well, it's difficult enough as it is for our children or ourselves to be able to find houses, to actually get houses that are reasonably affordable for us to buy, then they're not going to believe in the rest of the project, because all they'll see is a whole load of new people coming in competing for an already tight housing market.
And that's one of the reasons that the affordable housing schemes are currently under review, that the Housing Communities Board has asked for a full review of all the affordable schemes, precisely because of that, because housing is fundamental. I've said this many times before, housing is fundamental to everything. If the government is going to deliver on any bit of its island plan or its economic strategy, housing is absolutely essential to that, because if you haven't got the correct mix of, say, rental accommodation, affordable housing and private, higher end housing, you will not attract the people into the island that you require, but equally you won't retain the workforce and the population that you need to retain. And that then throws the whole demographic out as well and makes things a lot harder, both in terms of the raising of government revenue and delivering the projects that are within the island plan. So housing is fundamental to all of that. So, I fully agree. Housing is the absolutely essential thing. There are other issues to deal with as well that are up there, but housing has to be one of those. And what June was saying there before, again, it comes back to the funding model, and this is why I've said for many, many years, even back when I was a Douglas councillor, the whole deficiency, the whole way that we do funding of public housing needs to change, because at the moment that model, as far as I'm concerned, actually comes from a point of view of why should we do this rather than why shouldn't we do this. And that's where we need to actually flip it when it comes to public sector housing. Is there's land out there, there's land that could be, if we worked with the local authorities and the housing authorities around the island, that we could potentially unlock to be able to provide that. And like I say, the OHAN is very, very clear. We need 50 additional units a year, effectively, it works out at, and that's for the baseline projection.
And that OHAN overarching assessment of housing need? What?
Objective assessment of housing need, okay. Yeah. And that's over the next 20 years. And that's the baseline projection. If the projections start going even further and outside of that, then obviously that's even more units. And that's something we need to actually be starting to deliver now. It is going to be tight to deliver in this administration, but we need to ensure we're leaving a legacy for the next administration as well.
So for those who aren't aware, how does the current deficiency payment system work? Most people probably really don't understand it. In fact, there have been, in years gone by, housing officers who don't really understand how it works. What is the current system, and what needs to change? So
the simplest way I normally describe the deficiency is it's actually like having a bucket of water, basically. You have the rents that come in at a certain level that are set to try and be affordable level for people. That fills up the bucket so far, but the actual cost of maintaining those properties and the loans is actually more than that. So the deficiency is the difference. So it's the amount that comes in. A housing authority retains a set percentage for maintenance. They can retain an administration percentage as well. And for those that have ones with communal areas, there's a percentage that can be retained for communal areas. The amount left goes against the cost of that housing, and the deficiency is the difference between that amount left and the actual cost of those properties. So that's everything, including any repayments on loans, and that is met centrally by government each year. So the deficiency as well can go up and down, so it can actually change. So if you actually go back through the figures, and I've actually been sad enough to get the figures right back to the 90s, when this all really started in the later, just at the turn of 2000, you can actually see that some authorities go massively up and then drop the following year because things are going on and off the deficiency constantly. But again, I think it needs to be a much more ambitious system where we actually say, are we going to invest in public sector housing? The answer should be yes, and ensuring that we actually put the money in, because the subsidy, as I say, it works out, if you divide it across all social housing, at around about £14 a week per unit, which isn't a huge subsidy. That, again, sometimes I think the perception that might be out there in the public is very different to the reality.
So, in essence, because I heard your answer, but I wasn't entirely clear. What changes? What is the improved system?
So this is my personal view. I do have to be very clear on this. Other colleagues may have other opinions, should we say, but my personal view is it should be a centralised funding system. So there should be one central pot that actually is worked by government and the local authorities to be able to get together. I know, for instance, Douglas, and I think Ramsey have as well, have got a long-term plan as to where you're wanting to go with the social housing. I've seen some of those plans and they are ambitious, and they would do a lot for the island, and it's important that we look to see how we fund those. At the moment, the only way of funding it would be via the deficiency system, but the deficiency system isn't built to be able to cope with where people are wanting to do large-scale investment, and that's what needs to change. It needs to be a much more centralised pot that isn't just a budget sat in a government department. And
this is a pot that's not a pot with an annual limit. This is a pot that spreads over year ends to avoid the problem that you've identified. It's
ongoing. It's continuous. It's not like, for instance, the town centre regeneration scheme where there was a set amount of money and then when it's gone, it's gone. It's about ensuring there's continuous flow of build, and that will involve government working with the local authorities and housing authorities across the island to try and deliver.
And back in the day when we were sort of sparring, you were member for housing in Douglas Borough Council as it was at the time, and I was the housing minister.
The good old days.
We had some level of disagreement as to what should and shouldn't be included as deficiency payment, and inevitably, from a government perspective, government wants to be careful that it's topping up the legitimate needs of authorities to pay for housing, and not effectively subsidising the administration of a local authority.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, it can't be a free-for-all, and the deficiency does have very firm rules around what it can and can't be used for, particularly the administration element. I'm not suggesting that all needs to go out the window. You can still keep that separate, but what there needs to be a pot for future development. And one of the other issues with the way that deficiency works as well, and also the amount local authorities retain, is in relation to maintenance. It doesn't take into account the age of properties. So if you're a local authority that's got quite modern public sector housing, say built in the last 20 years or so on, your maintenance costs are going to be a lot lower than, say, for instance, a housing authority that's got stock that's 80, 90, even 100 years old. That isn't recognised anywhere in the system.
And of course, the assumption is there will be a spread of properties that each local authority will have, so that some will be new, some will be a few decades old, and others will be much older. So that is the assumption, but it doesn't always work.
But that's not how
way.
The reality always works out, because some local authorities have more one way than the other, and there needs to be some form of recognition, but there also needs to be able to be funding for new developments, and actually ensuring that we look at things strategically. At the moment, what we're reliant on is individual housing authorities coming forward with their plans, going through the process through DOI, which is the sponsoring department at the moment, and then going through the various stages before the local authority can find out even if they've got any funding there for it. And it doesn't feel to me like there's an overall strategic vision. There's never been sort of a strategic vision when it comes to public sector housing as to how do we pull it all together, and what are we providing in different areas of the island. And so it needs to be much more joined up. From the government side of things, with DOI's properties, that's what the Housing Association that's looking to be formed will be looking to try and do. It'll be much more than just a management of DOI's properties. It'll be looking to try and work in the affordable housing sphere as well and drive things forward. But we need something and some kind of mechanism that we can do that with the other housing authorities as well, to be able to support them.
Ewan, do you feel, as Ramsey Town Commissioner, that you are being listened to by government? Are you being actively engaged to try and find solutions to the housing crisis?
No, I think it's a very reactive system. I mean, it warms me to hear David talk about strategic visions and a view, and I think that is the way forward. Maybe some kind of housing committee could be set up, I don't know. Sorry, I couldn't resist that one. The thing is that we need to have, we've talked about this already in the show, that housing is not something that happens in a year. It happens in 3, 5, 10, 15 year cycles. You age your properties, that's how your funding model works as far as I can see, that you pay off the loan, and then once you've paid off the loan, that's when the bucket refills. The deficiency is that top up to allow that. But all that needs to be seen in a strategic view, in a longer term vision, in a 5-year, 10-year plan. That's not the case. That's not across the island, and that's something that a central body can definitely look at. It concerns me seeing the way that we're talking about this housing association. For me, everything points towards there being benefit in more government control, more single government vision, more principle-led approaches, and that's not what we're having, because what we seem to be moving towards is a very minute crunching of numbers, seeing the cost of everything and the value of nothing. There were 5 options that were in that redacted paper. I don't know if any of those 5 would be what you've just suggested there, David. I think what you would be looking for is ways to avoid having to pay money. The only way you can avoid paying money from the DOI is realistically to stop doing things, and that's not a good long-term solution. It might be a good short-term solution to placate budgetary constraints and placate the Treasury, but it won't help the Isle of Man going forward, and we will only see the impact of that in 5 to 10 years.
And it is fair to say, David, that a number of Treasury members and officers are seen to be going around with rather a lot more grey hairs this year than perhaps they had last year. Are we in a difficult financial position, more difficult perhaps than had been predicted?
Well, looking at the figures, I mean, I won't repeat my hour-long budget response that I gave at the budget time. There is some very tight situations out there, particularly in terms of the direction of travel and when government actually will come back into balance. But this is the issue, because what we mustn't do and we shouldn't be doing is what Ewan's referred to there, where he very well has put it in the phrase, knowing the cost of everything but the value of nothing. Because we need to be viewing housing as a valuable asset, because it is putting roofs over people's heads, it's maintaining people on the island, and they are then being economically productive if we've got our demographic right, and actually putting back into the system. So the actual economic multiplier effect actually ends up as a net benefit to the exchequer. So we need to be very careful that policies we're doing, when you say about not doing anything or stopping things, is that you don't actually have the unintended consequence of making the situation actually worse. So I think that's one of the reasons we need to actually ensure we're working with Treasury. One of the things the Housing Communities Board has been doing is going through a strategic plan, and trying to pull everything together across the different social housing and public housing and private housing spectrums. And the Housing Communities Board action plan, updated action plan, will be due to be published shortly. We've made great strides in the homelessness area in ensuring that we're getting a joined up system for tackling that and ensuring people end up in long-term accommodation rather than just repeatedly going around the wheel of the system. We've started looking at other aspects as well in terms of the affordable housing schemes, and what's important now is we also focus on ensuring that we push to ensure that public sector housing is where it needs to be, because I'll be quite honest, it's not where I'd like to see it at the moment. It hasn't been for a number of years, and I've been shouting about it for a number of years personally. So there is a lot of work to do, and like I say, all of it won't be completed in this administration, but we've got to ensure that we actually leave a legacy to the next administration that's worth that administration inheriting. And
building on the point, if we are still in quite difficult financial circumstances, the essential component is what everyone said at the election. We need to address the housing situation, and as you've said earlier, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Most people don't see that crisis being addressed.
Well, like I say, I think there is. I've laid out some of the things that are going on in the background. It isn't always there, but what I've said at the start of this interview, what's important now for the next 2 years is people actually seeing things they can actually feel, touch, and see things moving forward. That's actually the challenge for this administration in its final 2 years, as it goes into its final 2 years, to be able to deliver things that people can actually see and feel.
At the end of this 5-year term, do you think that we will look back at the Housing and Communities Board as a good idea, but not actually helping the situation? Or do you think that it has in some way achieved the ambition that the Chief Minister had set out for?
So I'm not just saying this because I'm chair of the board, but I had this view even before I was chair of the board. But actually, I think the Housing Communities Board has been exceptionally valuable, because yourself, Phil, and my view has always been government shouldn't be siloed in departments. It should be one government. One legal entity is the old phrase that now seems a bit discredited, but one government. And my view is that what that has done is it's actually pulled things together, because you have housing that's aspects of housing that's set in DHSC, you have aspects of housing that are set centrally in government, you have aspects of housing that are set in DOI. And one of the hardest things is when things cross over departments, ensuring everyone's pulling in the same direction. So the Housing Communities Board has done what it said on the tin it was supposed to do, which is pull all those disparate parts together. As I say, it's not a case of nothing's been achieved. We have a homelessness pathway now. We are openly talking about homelessness, which in itself hasn't always been the case in previous administrations. And we are actually redeveloping and changing things in terms of the affordable housing as well, and access to that. We've changed the criteria on access to public sector housing as well, and although I have my own views around some of the limits and things which I've expressed in Tynwald, and we are now looking at the objective assessment of housing need, where we didn't have any of that data collated. And so, like I say, if you look at the objective assessment of housing need, while some of it is blindingly obvious, as we started the interview with, some of it actually is showing undercurrents that without the collection of that data we wouldn't have known about. So I actually do think things have moved forward. I'll start as I'll carry on as I started, which is, do I believe things are going fast enough? At the moment, no. I'd like to see things go an awful lot faster, but we need to deal with what we've got and the systems we've got. But the important thing when it comes to public sector housing is engaging with the housing authorities to ensure that we can actually deliver more units going forward.
David's predecessor as chair of the Housing and Communities Board, Chris Thomas, often talks, Ewan, about the expertise that lies within particularly the larger housing authorities. I don't claim that Arbury and Rushden Parish Commissioners have much by way of expertise in managing our 4 houses, but the much larger housing authorities, he talks of that expertise. Do you think that expertise is being actively engaged with and listened to?
It's hard to say, because the DOI are not moving forward in any demonstrable way. I know I keep coming back to this, but what you have is a disparate group of housing authorities that are all local experts and have a lot of local knowledge, that all have their own individual plans. There's no centralised vision, and all are completely beholden to the whim or the strategy of the DOI at this moment in time. I think that while they are... It really frustrates me, the opportunity for, if you excuse the pun, to make housing the foundation of the success of this island. You've got the local draft economy strategy that is talked about reinvigorating brownfield sites. That is just ripe for social housing, a government body that can bring life back to the high street and bring people back in. But all of these things all end up sitting back at the DOI's door, and they aren't being proactive. They aren't looking at a 5-year plan. They aren't fighting for a vision. They are rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic, and we are lurching our way into an even deeper housing crisis while we await more direction. The local expertise is not being directed behind one central vision, and until that occurs, there's just no point in it.
And David, I suppose you are the expert on the Housing and Communities Board in relation to certainly Douglas's housing, because you served for quite some time as their housing lead. Is the Housing and Communities Board doing enough to engage with local authorities, do you think?
So in terms of engagement with local authorities and the Housing and Communities Board, that rests mainly with DOI, because they're the ones who've actually got the budget, and this is why the funding formula needs to change. This is why I'm saying everything needs to be much more central, because what we do need to get is that strategic vision. Because it's fine, Ramsey having a 10-year plan, Douglas having a 10-year plan, Port Hem, Port St Mary, Castletown can all have 10-year plans, but they might not necessarily all join together in the jigsaw, and that's why we need something much more centrally, where all the housing authorities, I keep going to saying local authorities, but there are housing boards, of course, across the island that aren't local authorities as well. Where we can engage with all housing boards at one level and actually say, right, this is where we want to be in 20 years' time. We know that from the OHAN, what we need to do. The OHAN even breaks down the type of units that we actually need, from 1 bed, 2 bed, 3 bed, 4. And we need to be pulling that all together to actually say, well, how do we deliver that together? And that is why it needs, from my point of view, a much more centralised funding structure, rather than worrying about it being cut. I mean, even the phrase deficiency tends to suggest it's something that's wrong. It's not. We need to be actually looking and saying that social housing is something worth investing in, and not see it as being a drain on taxpayers' funds. And at the moment, the way the system is set up for that funding and the process local authorities have to go through to apply to that funding doesn't actually provide for that sort of system.
Well, we're almost out of time. David, you have said that the next two years we have to see real and solid delivery. Are you convinced that in 2 years' time, if we're having a similar conversation, you'll be saying, and look what we've managed to achieve over this last 2 years?
Well, as you know, Phil, I'm the eternal optimist. It's certainly what I will be pushing for, and I have been pushing for at the Housing Communities Board. It's something I've stated very publicly in Tynwald. Obviously, I'm not a minister within government. I don't sit around the Council of Ministers table. So it will be for others to decide the direction of travel, including my colleagues in Tynwald. But from my point of view, if this administration is going to deliver on anything that it's said in the Island Plan or it's said in the economic strategy, housing is absolutely fundamental to that. And what matters to people out there is things they can see, touch and feel, not frantic energy going on in government offices. And that is the challenge, but it's certainly a challenge I, as chair of the Housing Communities Board, will be pushing on for the next 2 years.
So for those listening who don't understand political speak, I think you're hedging your bets.
No, I believe that if we carry on with what we've got in place in the Housing Communities Board Action Plan, then I believe people will see results on the ground. Let's be clear on that.
Ewan, are you as optimistic as the chairman is?
No, I would like nothing more than the Isle of Man to have a really good 2 years and be more successful, because it would be beneficial to everybody. But there's nothing I've seen in the previous 3 years that would make me think that the next 2 years are going to have something spring into life. 2 years is a long time for this government, and I just fear that we're already starting to look ahead to the next election, and people are just becoming too conservative. Needs to be some risks taken and some strong action. I just don't believe this is, sadly, the government for that.
And obviously, as a Ramsey Town Commissioner, you do have the opportunity to drive some of this change.
And, well, do we? In 2021, we made a bold move to purchase the Old Albert Road site to increase our footprint to have a new development. That was supported by the Deficiency Funding Scheme, the capital scheme, and that has sat waiting. Even £50,000 to demolish the existing buildings there is all sat behind the scenes. There is only so far we can push, which is why I have to put FOIs in, which is why I have to go public by myself, because all the good work that Ramsey Town Commissioners are doing to make a difference in the town always keeps hitting that ceiling, and that ceiling is the Isle of Man government.
That was David Ashford MHK, Chair of the Housing and Communities Board, and Ramsey Town Commissioner Ewan McGuinness. So what do you think? Are you seeing signs of the housing market becoming easier to access? Has government helped improve things, or are you still struggling to find suitable accommodation? Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. I'm Phil Gaughan, Guramaeus and Gaysach Rum. Thanks for listening.